All right, we are recording. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of the Downers Grove South Cross Country and Track podcast. I am your host, Mike Farthing, and today I am joined by DGS and Carthage alum David Fish. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Appreciate you having me on, Coach Farthing.
Like I had mentioned to you, when I had asked, and you should feel honored too. You are the first boy alumni that I have interviewed. And so when I asked Coach Senf and Coach Caldwell for, hey, who are some people that I should interview, and you were the first one. And there was a very select group too. So you were the first one. So that is why I'm interviewing you. And like I said, it's nice to finally meet and talk with you a little bit, because I feel like we've crossed paths quite a bit and just never really conversed much, you know. So how I usually start off the interviews is, I know that now that you're an alum too of college and you've had some experience, your story is a little bit longer, but that's totally okay. But maybe you can just talk about, how did you get into running? What was your experience like at DGS and Carthage? And then you can kind of tell us how you've ended up at Eastern Tennessee State.
Mm-hmm. So my running career started off back when I was in 6th grade at Lakeview Junior High. And initially, I was not for running. My parents figured, you should be doing some kind of sport. And I didn't really know much about cross country other than it involved running. So I signed up for it in 6th grade. I absolutely hated it. And, it kind of got to the point where my folks were like, all right, like if you stick for it, like long enough, you'll, get into it. And, got through that first year, didn't like it at all, but, I enjoyed the teammates that I had. So I came back out for it again in 7th grade. And then once I hit 8th grade, it got to the point where I realized, I'm actually finally enjoying this. I think I'll continue on through high school. And once I got into high school, I, being a freshman, had a lot more teammates than I did in junior high, just with the number of kids at that level. And, freshman year, I was able to definitely develop a lot. Same thing heading into my sophomore year. And then junior, senior year as an upperclassman, I was very surprised by some of the times I was able to rattle off and the development I had from junior high in just that 7-year span. Then from there, moving on into college, I ran for 4 years at Carthage. Same thing. There were plenty of times where I was very surprised that my performances were able to improve the way they did, especially since it wasn't until fall my senior year at DGS when I had my first serious injury with a stress fracture. And then unfortunately, I relapsed with another one again. What would it have been? That would have been spring of my senior year. And then I had my third and final stress fracture as of right now, the winter of my junior year at Carthage. So between those 3 stress fractures, I've been pretty fortunate otherwise in terms of having relatively consistent training. And then, after that, I was coaching for a year at Downers Grove South High School. And then after that year of coaching, I decided to go back to school, and that's what brought me to East Tennessee State.
What was your best time in high school?
What kind of races were we talking about?
For cross country or 3 mile or 5K.
So I don't recall a lot of my 5K times from high school. I believe the fastest 3 mile I had was a 15:24, and that was earlier on in my senior year of cross country. Because kind of a funny story about that is my junior year, I'd gotten sick early on, so I was doing a lot of catch up during cross country. My times didn't improve significantly, but then right off the bat for senior year, I had it where I was coming off of a high mileage summer where I was hitting 70 miles some weeks, feeling really good training wise. And we were going into our first competition at Lions Township, the Lions Pride Invite. And there was some confusion with when the varsity team was racing. So Caldwell came over and gave us a heads up. You guys are running in like the next 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes. Let's get over to the start line. So that was a big surprise to us. We're, getting everything ready, not really thinking too much. And the gun goes off, and, that training over the summer paid off significantly because I had dropped 30, 40 seconds off my previous
Wow.
best from the last season. So,
Mm-hmm.
running 15:25, I believe, for that invitational was a huge step in the right direction. And it really just boded well in terms of the level of confidence I carried throughout the season moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, 30 to 40 seconds would be a nice, target for an entire year, but to be able to kind of do that right away is um, pretty impressive. Uh, Maybe you can talk a little bit just about Carthage. So, one of the things I was thinking about before interviewing, just kind of looking over everything, was that Carthage being a Division III program, and now is East Tennessee. That's D1. I'm trying to remember, what conference are they in?
They're correct, Division I, and they're the SoCon, so the Southern
Okay.
Conference.
Okay. Is Appalachian State in that conference too? Or no, I guess they're part of the Sun Belt. Never mind.
Yeah, I know Furman is one of the more
Okay.
competitive schools that we'll run against in track and
Mm-hmm.
field and cross country. I'm trying to remember who else, because they actually had the cross country conference here in 2019.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not super familiar with this conference in
Yeah.
terms of some of the other schools.
Sure. Yeah. And I guess I don't want my question to get lost, but the reason why I wanted to bring up Carthage is just maybe you can talk a little bit about like the Division III experience, and based on, your experience now working at a Division I school, maybe talk a little bit about like the differences with that. Because I feel like, when I look back at my own experience, every kid in high school wants to run Division I, and obviously there's different levels of that. But if I were to really be honest with myself, now being much older and looking back on it, I would be probably a perfect candidate for running at a Division III school. So maybe you can talk a little bit just about your experience at Carthage and how that differs from running maybe at like a D1 program.
Absolutely. And, kind of to preface it, I think it's really important to just look at Division I, Division II, Division III, NAIA as just different opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
So, you have opportunities to get financial funding at Division I and Division II, but you can also have opportunities at Division III to face pretty high caliber competition. I'm going to throw North Central out there because they're a very prominent Division III school that, can compete with a lot of Division I schools. So
Mm-hmm.
there's always going to be that talent out there at the different levels. But again, it's just how you take the opportunities. So bringing that into Carthage, then the experience I had at Carthage was, team about half the size of what we were working with at Downers Grove South. So low to mid 20s in terms of athletes. So you knew everyone a lot better. But then also we had a coach that was starting off for his first year at Carthage, Josh Henry, because the previous coach had just left the summer heading into my freshman year. And, it was a cool experience having a first year coach. He had prior experience at Cortland College, but for him to really define and shape the program in a new light was really empowering because, being the first athlete that he worked with all 4 years, you got to see that growth over the course of those years that I was running with him.
Mm-hmm. And so would you say, I mean, I guess I always hear it from kids, but at least at the Division III program, I mean, it's still very competitive, especially when you get to the national meets. Many of those schools could compete or beat many Division I programs. But do you think that they do a better job of I think Division I programs try as well, but I just hear mostly at Division III schools, they really try to strike a balance more with the academic piece. And, there's some pressure, but maybe not, maybe coaches don't have the same pressure as like at a Division I school.
Yeah. So, talking about my teammates first, we definitely had a spectrum in terms of levels of ability. So that's the big thing about Division III is that you can really go in there and compete at whatever level you're able to. So if you're able to qualify for nationals, that's outstanding. If you're able to still be working towards breaking 5 minutes in the men's mile, let's say, that's still a goal of yours that, again, it's all about the opportunity, being able to take it. And especially with the academic load, as you're prefacing, there was more of a drive for us to be academically outstanding. Like our coach always emphasized and acknowledged the fact that, hey, you guys were on honor roll this year
Hmm.
and we're keeping this going for so many consecutive seasons. So make sure you're keeping that up, because that's the main reason why you're here is academics, and then athletics is going to follow.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think more, I know we have Mahesh from North Central that comes over to talk to our girls probably every year or so. And I'm not saying that they need to go to North Central. I know it's close, but I feel like honestly, if North Central wasn't so close to Downers Grove, it really would be a destination for some of our kids, but many of them just want to get away. But the Division 3, I mean, really does provide you an opportunity to take advantage of, 4 more years of running and competing. And, it's just tough because I know so many kids are always looking at Division 1 as being the thing. And sometimes they get there and they really have no idea what they're getting themselves into, and they don't realize even how competitive it is. So, I don't know. I just wish more kids would maybe take advantage of those Division 3, or, many kids too aren't even that familiar with like NAIA as well. So I feel like if running is, certainly something that you want to continue and it's important enough to you, that those should be areas that, you should try to look into.
Mhm.
So I think maybe you alluded to it a little bit, but do you still run competitively? Like, do you still train for anything at all?
So not after this most recent bond field.
Okay.
In terms of like my training, I definitely was keeping up with it that first year after college, just because I knew I had a little bit more left in the tank in terms of chasing lifetime bests. And
Mm-hmm.
then, like, even when I was out here at East Tennessee all of last year, and then this past fall semester, I had plenty of time to draw up my own training. But it got to the point last year where I realized, okay, I'm leaning on running a little bit too much. I think it's time to focus a lot more on academics. And, I was able to modify my training. So I'm not doing 60, 70-mile weeks. I was mostly
Mm-hmm.
focusing on trying to hit 40 on a consistent basis with 2 workouts and a long run. But it gets to the point where if you focus on training instead of life and learning,
Mm-hmm.
there's got to be a trade-off at some point. And like I said, I want to make the decision to start to become more of a learner, and there had to
Mm-hmm.
be some sacrifices here and there. But I'm still able to go out and run on a pretty regular basis. It's just now my mental energy is dedicated elsewhere, instead of, all right, we got to hit these paces. That was a great workout. And I do
Mm-hmm.
miss that high sometimes of being able to, let's say, do a mile repeat workout, run it faster than anticipated, and still feel great. But now it's time to, like I said, move on towards something else that I know is going to be rewarding in the long run.
Sure. Um, so I guess that kind of brings us into my next question for you. So what is your role right now at East Tennessee State? And how did you end up at East Tennessee State? Because I only know the school mostly because I mentioned to you like Brad DeWeiss, or is it DeWeiss or DeWeese?
Luis.
DeWeese, okay, because I only know him from some of the speed summits that I've gone to. Really great speaker and whatnot. Very provides a lot of information about different ways to train speed. I think he works with bobsled or
Mm-hmm.
something like that with like the Winter Olympics, really focusing on like the push start at the beginning of it. But anyways, about you, how did you end up at East Tennessee State, and what's your role there as a graduate assistant?
So, believe it or not, East Tennessee State was on my radar back senior year at Carthage. So,
Mm-hmm.
I had a professor who was originally from the Wisconsin area, but he went to East Tennessee State to earn his PhD.
Mm-hmm.
And well, in his kinesiology and exercise physiology classes, he told me, me and some other students are working on putting a poster presentation together to present at Coaches College at East Tennessee. Would you be interested in joining us? I said, yeah, absolutely. So there were, I believe, 8 of us, and Tony and one of his good friends. We all went down from
Mm-hmm.
Kenosha, Wisconsin, drove, through the night to get out to Johnson City, Tennessee. And then from there, that was my first exposure going to Coaches College for 2 days, getting to network at one of the dinners there. And
Hmm.
it was a cool experience because there were portions of the presentations that applied to what we were learning in exercise physiology, kinesiology, and then other aspects that kind of got me pretty excited to learn about sports science in the future. And, I
Hmm.
remember one of the final presentations from Clive Brewer, who works for the Toronto Blue Jays at the time. He was giving a phenomenal presentation on performance and making sure that you're appropriately applying science to sport and getting meaningful data out of it. And
Hmm.
on the way out of that, I was saying to Tony, like, because I was going the education route at the time, if education doesn't pan out, like that's the direction I'm going in.
Hmm.
And, Tony being from the PhD program had a lot of good things to say about the people that work there, mentioned that they had a master's program. So once I graduated from Carthage and realized, I don't want to do teaching. However, I think coaching and more so the sports science side of things will be my strong suit. Looked into East Tennessee, was able to land a graduate assistantship in one of the departments. And then the rest is kind of history, ended up here and I'm in the second year of my master's program.
Okay. And you work with the women's triathlon team, is that right?
So I was working with them for the
Okay.
past year and a half, but
All
then there
right.
was an opportunity for me to begin working with baseball.
Okay.
So I've transitioned to working with them, but I'll tell you a little bit about what I was working on with women's triathlon. So
Okay.
last year, it was primarily working with them in the weight room. So the whole first semester was just getting them familiar with some of the lifts that we were doing, helping them understand the terminology, so set rep scheme. And
Hmm.
then after that first semester of initially working with them, building a relationship with the coach and the athletes, we were able to then get them into our athlete monitoring program. So what that entailed was doing some regular testing, and the way we set it up, we try to do some non-fatiguing testing. So jumping, isometric testing, and
Hmm.
isometric, for those who aren't familiar with it, is a stationary form of testing where the joints don't move at all. And because of that, there's a lower risk of any kind of injury occurring. So we run those tests scheduled throughout the semester, and unfortunately we got short of testing them through the entire semester because of COVID, but
Hmm.
the whole goal from that testing was to show and utilize what was collected, that hey, what we're doing in the weight room is making these differences for jump height, rate of force development, and this is how we can apply these characteristics back to the sport of triathlon. But
Hmm.
like I said, I've switched over to baseball recently, and it was just an excellent growth opportunity for me because now I have the opportunity to work with a sport that's out of my domain. And
Hmm.
the guy who's currently running it does a phenomenal job in terms of doing daily readiness reports and making sure he's doing his best to make sure the athletes are cared for and their needs are being met.
Hmm. Now, do you approach, I mean, you probably don't approach baseball in the same way, but here would be my thing. So, like, as a part of the girls cross country team, I pretty much like the strength coach, only because I'm probably the person that maybe has the most familiarity or maybe understands like different methods and that kind of stuff. But I find so many kids, though, even myself included, really. But when I went off to college, I really had my knowledge of strength training was pretty limited.
Mhm.
So like when kids come in as freshmen, how do you, whether you've worked, whether with triathlon or baseball, whichever one you can speak to, but like how do you kind of get them situated and kind of develop that knowledge base? I mean, you guys kind of stick with more of like traditional lifts, like deadlift, squat kind of thing, or do you guys have a entirely different system?
So we'll obviously have our main lifts like, squatting, some of the Olympic lifts, but
Mm-hmm.
my main goal always is to try and get the athletes familiar with the terminology. So whenever I say a set rep scheme, they know, okay, we're doing, let's say 10 repetitions of these exercises for 3 sets worth. So that way they're thinking about it a little bit more. And then as well, like another piece of terminology we'll use on a regular basis is repetitions and reserves. So this is a way for the athletes to get a better understanding of like, let's say I have a set of 3 by 5 repetitions. If I'm doing it at, I believe it's like 70 to 80%, you want to have 5 or 6 repetitions left in the tank. And that's just an easier way for the athletes to then
Mm.
gauge, okay, like maybe I had more like 10 left in the tank, and they're going to load the weight more and get a more appropriate stimulus out of their training at the appropriate intensity.
Yeah, no, that's a good way of looking at it because sometimes that's something that I mean I don't struggle with, but trying to educate even the girls on is them being able to understand, you know, when they should add more weight, and that idea of like when you finish that set, if you can say to yourself, you know, there's a big difference between feeling like you got one more in the tank versus 5 more, and then you know whether or not it's time to maybe move up that weight a little bit.
Right.
Um, so, so what do you so what do you envision for yourself? So you finished the master's program at East Tennessee State. So where do you want to go from here? I mean, you're looking the PhD route? Do you want to like go get some sort of certification so that you can go work with like a specific sport in college and like, or I guess maybe go more of like the strength performance side of it?
So, yeah, in terms of my long-term career goals, I definitely
Mm-hmm.
want to continue learning. So, PhD program here at sports performance is my main goal right now, but then continue to pick up credentials like USATF, so their track and field certification I'm interested in. USA weightlifting is another one. There's
Mm-hmm.
actually a new sports scientist credential that you can get through the NSCA, so the National Strength and Conditioning Association, because it's such a growing field at this point that they found it appropriate to begin implementing means for holding a credential that's higher than a certified strength and conditioning specialist, which is what I currently hold.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it would be beneficial, and it's not really a thing in Illinois, but if you go down to like Texas or Florida where um, you know, you have, or even I think I saw someone in Indiana, areas where coaches can coach football, but they're like not teachers in the school, but they get paid almost as much or if not more than teachers do.
Yeah.
Um, do you think it would be beneficial though for like high schools to have a strength coach or to like designate maybe a particular teacher in the PE department to like be the strength coach to kind of work with like different teams?
Oh, absolutely. So I've been listening to some podcasts where they've mentioned some schools in the Chicagoland area that have begun taking on strength and conditioning coaches. And I've thought about it myself as well, but it's
Mm-hmm.
just immensely beneficial to have someone who is familiar with the technique of the lifts, as well as being able to implement any kind of monitoring protocol that can potentially benefit athletes. And again, just
Mm-hmm.
making sure that the athletes are appropriately introduced to the terminology that can then lay the foundation for them genuinely understanding and getting a lot more out of the training program instead of just, writing down the lifts and that's that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think a lot of coaches avoid the weight room. There's a variety of reasons. Sometimes you have a team that's so large you just can't really wrap your head around how you're going to get, 70 or 80 boys in the weight room, and let alone if you're sharing the weight room with another team, that also logistically makes it difficult. But also a lot of it is, if you don't really have the knowledge or you don't have access to someone that can help you, you just kind of avoid it, which isn't the worst thing in the world because, if you're not doing things right in the weight room, that's going to be detrimental to your performance for your sport. But, you and I know that there's a ton of, there's a ton of benefit though too for, being in the weight room because, it's not just about getting strong, but it's about, trying to teach like, trying to teach specific skills, in a way that is going to help translate to the field or the track or whatever the case may be.
Mhm. No, absolutely. And I think one of the big takeaways that like people need to realize for incorporating strength and conditioning at the high school level is that there's a lot that students are going to be able to learn from that coach that might not be covered in curriculum and that other coaches just might not have the knowledge of. So one primary example that I could think of is, let's say you have the sports coach. So let's say it's Coach Caldwell, for example, working with the strength and conditioning coach. Well, then that strength and conditioning coach would then be able to coordinate with him, what are your primary competitions you want to succeed at. And then in a weight room setting, those lifts, set rep schemes are able to be developed in a very unique way that sets the athletes up so they're loading appropriately, they're able to hit appropriate volumes and not necessarily incentives, but goals at that point in time. So let's say they're using block training, emphasizing different characteristics of strength, speed during those blocks of training leading up to, let's say, the state meet or sectional meet, and having those pay off in a way that, all right, we were able to lay the foundation early with a return to fitness phase, a strength endurance block, and build up so that it's going to be a lot more muscle fiber development by that point instead of, okay, we're just doing a high set rep scheme here because they're distance guys.
Right. Yeah. And another hard part too is even, have you ever heard of Michael Yessis? He has like a 1x20 program. Maybe you've heard of it before.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it'd be interesting to, I haven't heard like his reasoning behind it, but I want to hear that first.
Yeah. Well, I will admit, I used it for, cause I don't know. I think the easiest thing to do is whatever you're doing, just to make sure you go slow and make sure the kids are safe and they're doing the different lifts correctly, and I kind of went that route more or less because, with the idea is you do one exercise, 20 reps, you don't do multiple sets or anything like that. And then after a while, then you move from one set of 20 to like maybe one set of 14, one set of 8, and you kind of move along that sort of. And it's supposed to be, sometimes it's used as like a recovery, especially like after a season, or sometimes a guy might just be like plateauing and they just kind of need a break from their nervous system. So it's something to kind of do for a while and then kind of come back a little bit. I mean, and I don't dislike it. I think I'm going to change it the next time that we can, start kind of getting the strength training thing up and running again, because with distance, it's like, they do so much endurance. So you really do want to focus on, a lot of the research says you should do kind of like max lifting or heavier lifts, because then you're working a different energy system, because otherwise if you're just doing volume, you're just working more of the same thing that they're already doing. But I guess the thought process behind it is, you give them a variety of different movements. And so the idea is that, if you continue to do like lunges and you've done 20 of them, and so it's really just working on kind of like compounding the movement so that it kind of gets like ingrained in the body. And then like once they get to that point, then it's like, okay, now you can start pushing the weight, or you can move into like a different program altogether.
Right. So going back to the example I threw out there for, a stereotypical like 3 sets of 10 repetitions, I even had that for a little bit in college there. And you're absolutely right in terms of the coach's initial mindset would be, since these are endurance athletes, we should be lifting with more of a endurance focus. But as you also mentioned, kind of the drawback to that is they're not developing max strength. And just to kind of lay it out for viewers, is the way you want to have it set up is that any lifts that are being done early on, those are just going to be emphasizing technique. So making sure that the athletes are lifting appropriately, and any gains they see over the first few sessions, few weeks of training, that's all going to be technique-based improvements in how they're able to execute the movements. Then from there, it gets to the point where it's going to be neural. So, how your muscle fibers are being recruited, that's going to be the next stage of development that athletes are going to experience as their lifting program continues. And then finally, you're going to have muscle fiber development from that point. So you're really not getting any kind of change physiologically until later on. It's all, like I said, technique initially, then neural adaptations, and then finally the fibers will develop. And kind of drawing this back into why sets of 3x10 just don't really cut it anymore is
Mm-hmm.
because you want to have a higher ceiling. So tying this into running, for example, let's say you want to try and break the 15-minute mark for a 3 mile. Well, it's going to be pretty challenging to be able to break that barrier if your fastest mile is a 4:50.
Mm-hmm.
So same thing with resistance training. If you have a higher ceiling of strength, you're able to then have a higher rate of force development, and you know it's going to be a better way to have overall conditioning of the athlete instead of, let's say, just relying on a high repetition injury prevention program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it kind of goes along too with like even just like in the sprint world too. I mean, 3 sets of 10 is like, if you're running the 200 in practice, you're always doing repetitions of like multiple 200s, and like that's all you're doing. But every once in a while, right, you need to like ramp up the intensity and do like some, 30-meter flies or something where you just have to simply, your body has to learn how to just produce more force, and then that little stimulus is what's going to like help you make that jump in your events.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and that's always just kind of hard to like coordinate. And then and then in high school, even like at least some kids, more kids in college at least most kids come in with some level of strength training. But then like in high school, it's like some of them have never even been in a weight room. And then with girls especially, there's a little bit of like, this intimidation factor a little bit. So, it's always kind of tricky. But I do find, generally speaking, at least the ones that buy into the strength training, like over the summer when we have a camp, we have the camp for running, and then we have a separate like speed and strength camp. And the girls who sign up for the speed and strength camp, I mean, it's usually our top runners, but there's also other girls that are not, varsity, but they really have a desire to get better. And it's the ones that actually do the speed and strength that when we get to the season, they are the ones that do not get hurt.
Mm-hmm.
They might get hurt if they're doing too much mileage or they're not taking care of themselves outside of practice. But in terms of being able to just handle the training and like the work capacity, they're definitely the ones that are like, they're more durable throughout the season.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's incredible what you can get out of a strength training program. Granted, in retrospect, over the course of my running career, there were definitely aspects of, let's say, an injury prevention program specifically that would have benefited me. So, like I said,
Mm-hmm.
I had a handful of stress fractures. Resistance training is good and all, but,
Mm-hmm.
in those situations, it's not really going to help your foot as much as you think. So, being able to do like toe grabs with marbles or developing the muscles
Mm-hmm.
around the foot, that's going to be pretty unique compared to the extent of what you would get out of a resistance training session. So at that
Mm-hmm.
point, you have to just coordinate with athletic training staff or be proficient in terms of realizing what's needed for that athlete at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, so kind of leading into this here. So, after you were done at Carthage, you did have the opportunity to come back and coach at DGS. You were also a personal trainer too at the same time, right?
Yep.
Okay. So can you talk a little bit just about like, I mean, your experience coming back to DGS? What did you learn from the experience?
Mm-hmm. So first of all, it was super rewarding getting to go back to where I went to high school, ran all
Mm-hmm.
4 years, working with the coach that I got to run for during that time, and just kind of see how things have changed. The team was in a very different place from how I left it my senior year. And the other cool thing was just knowing the guys that were seniors or juniors at that time. Because, like I said, I was keeping in contact with them, saw what their times were, their improvements over the years. So it
Mm-hmm.
was a pretty smooth transition in terms of working with the cross country team. And then when they were able to achieve what they did at the sectional meet, like I
Mm-hmm.
was just ecstatic about that because, it was a program first, but like knowing what those guys did over the course of the 4 years to get there just made it like that much sweeter to experience. And then heading into the track season, I was primarily focusing on working with jumps and sprints. So
Hmm.
working with Felix Leahy, who
Hmm.
like this is
Yeah.
something I'll preface later when we're talking about books, but
Uh-huh.
um, like that kid just had straight up talent, and being able to coach that level of talent, but then also working with other guys where it's like, all right, like you guys are pretty solid technique wise right now, but
Hmm.
what else can we do at practice and in the weight room to help you get to the level where we're improving over the course of the season? And
Hmm.
like even working with sprints, something as simple as having the freshmen be confident heading into a race, like,
Hmm.
you got this, right? We've been able to hit what we wanted to do in workouts. Like your hard work's going to pay off. It's just a matter now of taking advantage of the opportunities that are present today and learning from them as we move forward.
Hmm. Yeah, Felix, he can jump out of the gym for sure. And he didn't have an opportunity to show more of what he could do last year, but I hope this year he still wants to come out, and I think he's only maybe a couple inches away from at least tying the school record, so
Yeah.
that'd be pretty great. Um, what so when you worked with the sprinters, I mean, definitely, I mean, you had been a distance runner, through high school and through college. But I mean, you studied, sports science and kinesiology and all that, like in college. So, like, was that a hard shift for you to like be working with sprinters during track?
Yes and no. So the previous head coach, Coach Hauser, he was
Mm-hmm.
able to send me some information on sprints, and then I was
Mm-hmm.
able to collaborate with Coach Senf on designing their program.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of running the practices and seeing the growth in the guys, it was just being able to put on a confident face, approach them with positive attitude, and that kind of took care of establishing a culture. And I
Mm-hmm.
think having that culture aspect as you're heading in as a new coach, especially like let's say in an off event, is one of the most beneficial things you could do to really get guys bought in and make the process so much smoother in terms of providing them feedback or getting critical with that wasn't a good performance, or saying we got to change this up, and it has to happen in a pretty short time frame for us to really get something out of these opportunities that are ahead.
Mm-hmm. And I remember something too, like as a young coach too, still young, but now I'm in my 14th year or something like that. But uh, it's like one thing to really like, you're so like focused on the training aspect, but like, how about like just having those like conversations with athletes to really try to like, bring the best out in them? Like, did that come natural to you, or do you feel like that was something that you had to kind of work at?
I felt like it came naturally to me because a little bit more about my history at DGS. I was really involved in ACE, Athletes Committed to Excellence. I was pretty involved with Mad Dash during my time there as well. And, having those leadership opportunities early on really made me grow as a person when it came to interacting with others, providing feedback. But as a coach, you have to realize, you're not their friends, so you have to approach
Mm-hmm.
them much differently than you would if you were one of their peers. And, part of that is being firm with the athletes, kind of telling them how it is, but at the same time assuring them that, this is a growth opportunity. So it's on you at this point, putting the ball in their court, making sure that they can problem solve on their own and get something out of a good performance, a bad performance, and be able to become self-sufficient to the point that they can identify steps moving forward to again achieve that personal growth.
Mm-hmm. Um, so that's a good segue here, personal growth, into maybe talk a little bit just about some books, because you had mentioned that there was some books that you thought were worth sharing, that athletes should read up on. And actually the last few years for the girls, we've recommended like different books for them, a lot of it tapping in more to like the mental aspect, because I feel like you know at least in terms of like where we're at as a program, I feel like the training, we're at a good spot, and um, doesn't really change much probably. I mean, maybe the boys program, on paper looks different than what the girls are doing, but in general, we're doing intervals, we're doing tempo, we're doing easy runs, and you want to like tap into that mental piece so that kids just feel more confident when they got to toe the line and actually put together a good performance. So what were some books that you thought were worth sharing with the athletes?
So the first one has very little to do with sports, but it's called Culture Code, and Culture Code has to deal with, what makes effective teams. So being
Mhm.
able to identify interactions that you have with one another and how to work towards creating a culture where individuals are able to grow, but the team is able to grow as well. So it's not focused on, let's say, your top athletes or the leaders on the team. It's trying to get the most out of everyone and realizing, even as a follower, you can have a significant impact in how a performance develops over the years and being an essential piece in the team and the program. Then another one is called Peak Performance. And this author, Steve Magnus, he's written a ton of other great books that I have. One of them is The Science of Running, but in Peak Performance, I think this one is very beneficial to young athletes and people in general, because it gives you ideas in terms of how to mentally approach situations, what you can do in terms of, let's say, getting rid of blue light on your phone. And it just hits a
Mhm.
ton of different effective ideas and approaches to making sure that you're able to be effective in your approach to whatever you do. So again, kind of applies to people in general, but athletes, especially young athletes, I think can get a lot out of this book and be far more disciplined in terms of how they approach what they do, both in the classroom setting and in an athletic setting. Then the next one is called Which Comes First, Cardio or Weights. And it's just a good introduction for young athletes to have in terms of understanding the basics of, is icing really that beneficial? Is rolling beneficial? What can I get out of running on this surface? Is cycling, treadmill, elliptical really all that different? So
Mhm.
being able to, again, kind of learn independently, but be able to apply it back to their sport. And then the final one is sports gene. So for this one, it's really about the genetics behind how we're able to perform as athletes. It goes from, body types to any kind of adaptations athletes might be able to gain. And it's a little bit of a tougher read, but at the same
Mhm.
time, if you're able to comprehend it and maybe revisit it once you have more background knowledge, you can really appreciate the potential you have as an athlete and really have a better understanding about what goes into those top performers you see around the world.
Mhm. Yeah, I thought, and maybe I'm wrong, because like I said, it's been probably about 5 years since I've read that book, but it was the whole what wasn't there a story in that book? It was about wasn't something about altitude training? I thought
Yep.
I feel like they came in the book, and it stemmed from I think the Olympics in Mexico,
Yep.
and from that story, that was like how this whole idea of like running at altitude with an oxygen deficit was going to be like a stimulus for you once you went back to sea level. I remember that being like one of the more interesting stories, and I always like wondered why, because I always thought like it was really silly to see people at like export wearing some sort of like mask, which I hear is a terrible idea, by the way. Don't wear a mask. It definitely makes working out harder, but I don't think it has the same stimulus effect as actually running at altitude. But I know I feel like that was one of the stories that really stood out to me in the
So to
book.
break down mass a little bit more, I actually did a presentation on this during my physiology 2 course, which had to do with the cardiopulmonary system.
Hmm.
And those masks, like you said, they really don't stimulate the altitude. What they do instead is they will make it harder for you to inhale. So
Hmm.
that's called what was it? I think it was like ventilatory threshold. So what it does
Hmm.
for that is it strengthens your muscles so that you're able to inhale. But to get true altitude, what you have to do is be at a higher altitude where there's a
Hmm.
lower concentration of oxygen. So,
Hmm.
like I said, for the mass, it's going to strengthen your lungs in terms of taking a breath in, but the air it's taking in still has the same amount of oxygen that you would deal with on a day to day basis.
Hmm.
So, once you change that percentage of oxygen intake, then you start to get those adaptations, and of course has to be over a long enough period of time.
Mm-hmm. What were some of the other stories in there? I know they talked a little bit about like East Africans. I feel like that came up in the book.
I'd say my favorite one
Yeah.
was the Big Bang of body types. So in that chapter, they talked about different body types. So let's say Northern European compared to
Mm,
African,
okay.
and you're going to have significantly different body types. And this is based off of, how different populations of humans evolved over the years. So in Africa, for example, they're going to have taller proportions and more surface area. That's of course to deal with the heat that they need to
Mm-hmm.
deal with on a daily basis. So they're going to have longer body proportions and they're going to be significantly leaner. That's
Mm-hmm.
going to be the deal with, or that's going to be far more beneficial with running, for example, where if you go to Northern Europe, they're going to be slightly shorter.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be because they needed to retain heat because of how much further north they were and the
Mm-hmm.
amount of cooler weather they'd need to deal with. But those shorter proportions of the body is going to benefit them in, let's say, a weightlifting setting. So you tend to see a lot, stockier or shorter
Mm-hmm.
weightlifters of Caucasian descent in weightlifting compared to, let's say, someone from Africa trying to
Mm-hmm.
out bench someone or out squat someone.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean that book really, like I said, it was a heavy read at time. I'll be honest, I didn't understand all the technical terms in there, but I'm glad when authors do use it because all I do is I just circle it and then I go look it up later, so that it doesn't impede with my comprehension. But it really did open up my eyes a little bit. Um, you know, I guess kind of knowing the truths a little bit in terms of like what your ceiling. I mean, we all kind of know that when we're born, we get the genes from our mom and dad, and that has a lot to do with what we, might be able to achieve. But, I still believe that everyone benefits from, you know, all different varieties of exercise. But, when you start to really figure athletes out enough, or if you can work in more of a like personal setting, then you can start to do things that are a little bit more like specific to their actual needs instead of being, working with a team of 50 guys and sprinters. And it's like, you just can't do the same things with them as you can like in a smaller session.
Absolutely. And you got to look at it too. Training is a way for you to maximize genetic potential. So, me, for example, the fastest mile I've ever run was just barely under 4:30. And if I had goals or aspirations to be a sub 4 minute miler, well, a lot of that will probably come down to genetics if you look at the times I currently have, the training I put in. So I might not have the genes to make it under 4 minutes in the mile, but based off the training I was able to achieve, you know, maybe I was able to maximize my performance in that event.
Mm-hmm. What would you say? How do I want to word this? So like, okay, so you went through high school, you went through college, and then I mean, you did have a brief period where you were kind of training on your own, but you also were your own coach.
Mm-hmm.
So like, and because you end up reading all this stuff in sports science, and all you want to do is just go through the menu of stuff and see like what works for you and what doesn't. Is there anything that like you tried that was maybe different than anything you did like in high school or college in terms of maybe like just training for a distance race?
So I think one of the big differences that I had in terms of my approach to training was going through each training session, specifically when it came time to running a workout, with not a more lax approach, but just kind of listening to how I felt more. So if
Mm-hmm.
I knew that, for example, this 400, going through the first couple repetitions of it, that I could be running this a little bit faster, or I've had a heavy week based off other workouts I had, maybe my recovery runs weren't as slow as they needed to be, so this workout I'm not going to get as much out of it, but I can at least finish it in a way that it's a step forward, instead of trying to dig too deep, run it faster than I'm capable of at that time, and digging myself in a hole. So I think that was the big takeaway that I got from coaching myself, is it's really an art and listening to your body.
Mm-hmm.
But then also just seeing what I could do off of lower mileage. Cause,
Mm-hmm.
my goals outside of my first year of college was I don't want to be running 70-mile weeks anymore.
I don't blame you.
Yeah, I'll do my best to take advantage of what I can do based off like 50, 55 miles worth of training and, run the workouts from there. But
Mm-hmm.
then the other thing too is just kind of playing with recovery runs. So, what is really going to be slow enough for me to recover from this? What's going to be the
Mm-hmm.
higher end of that? And again, same thing as the workouts. It really came down to playing it by ear. So if I just felt like garbage after a workout where I was running up the hill and
Mm-hmm.
into the wind, I'm going to take the next day significantly slower, or I might even just cross train, just have it
Mm-hmm.
where there's no impact on my body, but I'm still getting some kind of cardiovascular workout in. So really listening to my body, I feel like was the big takeaways from being my own coach.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think, like, for high school athletes? Because I think as the further along you go in your career of running, you are more reflective on races and workouts, and you start, like you said, start to really kind of listen to your body. Like, is there anything that you could recommend for like high school athletes to like strategies for them to be able to kind of do that themselves when maybe they just haven't had a ton of experience with the sport?
Yeah, so I'd say a big takeaway for young athletes is when you're competing early on in your career is really begin to just observe what it was like leading up to the competition and then post competition. And from
Mm-hmm.
there, you're able to then formulate for future competitions. Okay, this worked out for me here, and I felt this way, or this was really a bad idea, and I have to make these changes in the future. So, an
Mm-hmm.
example of it that I know a lot of guys have started doing in cross country is they'll do a shakeout day of prior to their competition.
Mm-hmm.
Me, I'm not a big fan of that.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's kind of just based off what worked for me growing up. So I
Mm-hmm.
knew, hey, a 5 mile easy day before is all I really need. I don't feel a need to shake it out in the morning in order to perform the way I want to.
Mm-hmm. And how much to like just like now that you're gaining, knowledge that you didn't have from when you were in high school or in college, but then, one of the things that I always kind of, and maybe I don't find it as much now because now I've been doing this long enough and attended different things, but like there's a tendency sometimes still with like coaches where you tend to kind of go back to like things that you did when you were younger, but like now that you have this new knowledge, it's like, you know, sometimes some people are a little hesitant to kind of like go and like try, something different, like, because it's really easy to kind of like settle with something that is going to be like kind of beneficial, but to try out like a new idea, like, I guess I don't even know if I'm even making sense, but does that
No,
make
you
sense
are.
to you? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to trying something new, you really have to have a good idea of one, what you're trying to achieve, and
Mm-hmm.
two, if what you're trying to implement really has the appropriate components to achieve that. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, one example that I was actually talking to my old college coach about, and like, sorry for some of the viewers if this is going to be really over the top, but again, going back to block periodization, we have it where, let's say we're focusing on a strength endurance component, that's going to be, anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks of focusing on that skill, but trying to have what you're doing in the weight room align with what you're doing in,
Mm-hmm.
let's say, cross country training. And typically a block will wrap up with a easy week, or we call it a down week sometimes in running, but really being able to dial back the intensity during that final week of resistance training and trying to have that align with, let's say, a down week in running where there's either less mileage, less intense workouts. And, I was talking to my coach about it because I couldn't find really, what was it? I was looking in the lore of running and in the science of running. And they did have down weeks in there, but they really,
Mm-hmm.
and my whole thought process behind it. And this is like the other part that I was talking about a minute ago was making sure that you're looking at the components that make it up. So my initial thought process was on a smaller scale, let's look at the easy days easy and hard days hard. If you're running an interval workout, a tempo workout, you, for the most part, want to make sure that your resistance training is falling on that day, or even if you're
Mm-hmm.
doing a long run, that's a fatiguing form of volume instead of intensity in that case. But you want to have your workouts in the weight room fall on the same days as you work out on the track or your
Mm-hmm.
long run. So then scaling that up a little bit more to, you know, hard weeks hard, easy weeks easy, making
Mm-hmm.
it so that, all right, we're going to be building up our intensities during, you know, this kilometer repeat workout, but we're also going to be building up our intensity in the weight room once we hit this down week again for both running and then the weight room, completely unloaded. So then the athletes are going to be able to fully and genuinely recover from that. Now, one thing that can be conflicting there is the time frame it takes to get adaptations or any kind of changes with your running programming and making that align with weightlifting, but then also the competitions you have to deal with. So you,
Mm-hmm.
one, have to be knowledgeable enough in order to be able to structure it, but two, you kind of have to get to be very fortunate with how things work out. And, you know, a third
Mm-hmm.
factor with that is each athlete is pretty unique. Because when I was talking to my old coach, Coach Henry from Carthage, was there are guys who are on different wavelengths in terms of when their down week was going to fall. And
Mm-hmm.
part of that had to do with what they were training at that point, if they were coming back from injury. So, you know, all those factors can really change up how you initially had your resistance training aligning with your sport specific training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's why, I mean, I think one of the most important skills, and it's hard, but to teach the kids about how to really listen to their body and like, what does that mean? Because, you know, it's hard as a coach. I mean, because you put together your plan, but like not everyone's going to follow the same plan. You know, some kids, like, I find, you know, as you kind of move up a little bit with, let's say, like distance running, you know, some of our top girls, I mean, they can recover from a Saturday race within, you know, 48 hours, you know, but there's other kids that they're new to the sport, you know, they probably shouldn't do a workout on Monday. You know, maybe they'll finally be ready to do it on Tuesday, or maybe they're only, maybe one workout a week is like all they can handle in order to make sure that they perform, you know, at that meet on Saturday. We had a girl last year, um, who run really well. And I mean, I think she still dropped 30 seconds from the year before with her 3 mile time. And she was essentially not running on the easy days. She was not putting in any extra mileage on the recovery days. But what she would do instead is she just did a lot of mobility, ankle strength, body weight kind of stuff that she would do. So she needed her recovery days to be like really easy. And then the hard days, she was working really hard. And that worked really well for her. This past year with COVID, you know, we had to split up our team into like 6 groups of 10 or something like that. And I was working with, you know, kids who had never even run cross country, or they, you know, they were very new to it, or maybe they had run it before or whatnot. I mean, I think we were running 15, 20 miles for the week, and that was including the 3 miles on Saturday. And I mean, and when you're new, you're going to see big gains anyways, but you know, they all ran remarkably better. You know, some of it was just being in better shape. Some of it was just having more confidence in themselves to be able to run the 3 miles. But it seemed like the reality was that the low mileage just worked really well for them. And even with our varsity group, the top group, I mean, there's a couple girls on the team that could really probably pour on the mileage, you know, where they would maybe get up to 50 miles a week at like the peak. But then there were some girls where, you know, once they hit 30, you better put them on an elliptical because they're just going to fall off the rails and they're not going to be ready to run on race day. And that's ultimately what you want them to do.
Mm-hmm. And a big part of that, you know, for athletes watching this and just understanding how the body adapts, it doesn't all adapt at the same pace. So
Mm.
cardiovascularly, your muscles, your tendons, ligaments, all those will adapt at different rates. So being able to start off with, like you said, a lower mileage is going to be significantly more beneficial than trying to ramp mileage up, because it could take, months more for certain adaptations to develop. And you want to be able to lay a foundation where the athletes are not getting injured, because, taking time off like that can really limit the forms of exercises they're going to be able to perform, as well as the intensities. So you want to gradually progress and make sure that you've laid the appropriate foundation for the next level to be built, and then keep on working your way up from there. So then, they are able to hit, 50, 60-mile weeks, and still being able to get the appropriate training in, whether it's workouts, long runs, and making sure they're staying healthy in the process.
Yeah. And I think too, the other thing that, I mean, both coaches and athletes alike too, when you're talking about, something being aerobic, that's just that's a level of heart rate. It doesn't necessarily always have to, look the same. You can still get benefits out of, building up your aerobic capacity. You don't have to run. You could bike, you could do whatever. So like, if that's the goal of whatever it is that you're trying to achieve, I think that's why as an athlete, you just need to be really in tune with your body. And, if you're the kind of person that just can't handle as much mileage, you shouldn't. It's hard because you want to do the same things as your teammates, and you don't want to look different or feel like you're weak or something like that. But I mean, alum that you're familiar with, Michaela Hackbarth, won 2 800-meter, state championships. And she was a kid that was low mileage, and, her big thing was speed. So, I mean, there's a variety of ways to get to where you need to be. But I think that it's important that, you as an athlete, is that you just really try to be in tune with, like you said, like, what did you do leading up to the performance? Look at what happened afterwards, and start to figure out like what kind of kid you are. And I think, Coach Caldwell or Coach Plunkett, I mean, they're very open. You just need to talk to them about,
Right.
what's working well for you, and you guys can have like a real conversation about that. I think so many kids, sometimes they get a little nervous coming to the coach and be like, I can't run this workout. Like, well, why? Is it because you didn't do a good job recovering? Do you really need an extra day? Or are you just scared? Are you just scared of this workout because you're nervous of failing or hurting or whatever the case may be?
So, addressing one of Caldwell's philosophies, and this was a philosophy he had when I was an athlete. It might have changed over recent years, but it was essentially, running is running. That's how you get better at running, is running. And we're like, okay, but what about like cycling? We can still get something out of cycling, right? Like, what amount of cycling does it take to really get the same performance you would out of running? Or same thing with the elliptical. And, kind of like a simple answer and a story to go with it. So the simple answer is, it's not going to correlate exactly with running. Running is running, but at the same time, you're able to burn calories, have like a certain amount of output that could eventually equivalent to running, but it also depends on the effort that you're putting into it. So like, for example, there was this guy, Jeremy Craven, who, and like, this is like one of my favorite stories in terms of an athlete who like took it into their own hands. He was a graduate of 2014 from high school like me, except he went to Downers Grove North.
Okay. Yeah. The name's familiar. Yeah.
And he ended up running at Purdue and being very successful. But his senior year, he was out, what was it? It was 2 to 3 months, 2 months. And he was out from essentially like, what would that have been, September through majority of October. And what he was doing during that time frame was he was working out 7 days a week, but the way he structured it was every day was a 2-a-day. So he would do 75 minutes in the morning, 75 minutes in the afternoon on the elliptical 4 days a week. Wow. And then he would do 90 minutes in the morning, 90 minutes in the afternoon, 3 days a week. And he would usually throw in a pool workout here and there, supplementing out one of those 90 or 70-minute sessions, as well as including 2 fartlek workouts over the week. So you do that kind of training where it's, volume at that point, but including appropriate intensities over the course of that time, you are going to get better. So, he wasn't running at conference. So that's 3 weeks out from state. He
Hmm.
wasn't running at regionals, which is about 2 weeks out from state. He comes back and runs a sectional meet in, oh, what was it? I have it written down. He ran it in a 15:12 for his first race in
Hmm.
2 months at that point.
Hmm.
And he was one of the guys at the state meet then who was able to be, I think he's placed fourth for Downers Grove North that year. And that was the year
Hmm.
they had gotten second place. So, a
Hmm.
trophy.
Right.
And he was doing that all based off of pool workouts. So it's really
Hmm.
what you put into the training that yields the results. And it also depends on the modalities of training. So that was what
Hmm.
he had at his disposal at that time. And he was able to take full advantage of that opportunity to improve his performance.
Yeah, yeah. That the pool workouts reminds me. Do you remember Coach Meeks? She was an assistant
Yeah.
coach with Coach Plunkett, and when she was at Illinois State, and her teammate actually came and talked to the girls, because that's kind of like what we were starting to do, is having these Friday team meetings. The girls would go out for like a 15-20 minute run, and then we'd have different guest speakers lined up. But anyways, her teammate's story was that she was a senior, actually fifth year senior, I think, at Illinois State, and she kind of the same thing. She got hurt, um, and really all she had at her disposal was um, the pool. So she pretty much did pool workouts for months and months and months, and then her last race as was at conference, Missouri Valley Conferences, and she was able to actually break her PR at conference. So like that kind of just, again, another story of just, you got to be able to use what you have in front of you, and you can still get your goals accomplished if you really get after it. All right, hang on, guys. Here, just a moment. It looks like we lost Coach Fish here, so we'll give him just a second to pop back in. We're going to see here if he can join back in here on the Zoom, or if I'm going to need to stop it and roll the tape again here. Let's see. All right. Well, that's always one of the challenges here with Zoom and the Wi-Fi. So I'm going to go ahead and end this recording here for now, and then we'll try to get up the another 15 or 20 minutes here with Coach Fish.